Town, episode 6. My name is Stephen Cole, author of the book and of the podcast Full Crazy Town. It's the way every podcaster in the world and media person in the world, especially the United States, is talking about these days. Today, the United States war against Iran. Who would have ever thought it could come to this? Well, it has. And podcasters are kind of split on this will not go well with Israel to Iran on the edge of regime change to United States will get us all into World War III to if you don't have a bomb shelter, then too bad for you. The billionaires do. So we are screwed. But I'm of the opinion, just wait and see. I mean, just because I want to be, I don't want to sink into despair. And anytime we start talking about Israel, Bibi, Jews, I have to shift the focus to the Zionists. And in my book, Full Crazy Town, talk about the Zionists a lot and about their plan for the dominionists related to the evangelicals, related to the Zionists who want to take over the world, starting in the Middle East, and basically out to destroy all governments and religions. And if their evil plot is ever discovered or the finger starts to point at them, the plan is to blame the Jews, not the Zionists, and divert attention. So in my book on, Zionists. Oh, yeah. Well, okay, on page 172, the first full paragraph starts off, history shows that the Zionists rose to prominence early in the 20th century. Before that, they were a secular fringe organization that used Judaism to further their settler colonial goals. Before that, thousands of years ago, the protocols of Zion were used to plan for. Now, I'm not quite sure where that first popped up. It seems to me like, I read Robert Anton Wilson's trilogy, The Illuminati, and it seems to me like it was mentioned in there. But the Illuminati's goals have been conflated with the Freemasons' goals, have been conflated with every secret society, every bunch of illuminated, chosen people will save the world through our superior brain power. And, you better be with us or you're against us kind of stuff. But anyway, the protocols of Zion were used to plan for world domination. These protocols call for the imposing of the Luciferian ideology on what would remain of humanity after the final social cataclysm by use of satanic despotism. If this Zionist scheme was ever discovered, Plan B was to be executed. Blame the Jews for all the world's problems to divert suspicions from themselves. In the 1930s, the Nazis minted a coin with German Zionists on it, with a Star of David on one side and a swastika on the other. whereas the Jewish people and the Palestinians had lived in relative harmony before 1920. Starting then, more Zionists began moving to Palestine and violently advocating for a separate and not equal Israeli state, Zion, ancient Judea. But that in the Jews of ancient Judea were, like everybody else in the area, brown skinned, whereas the new Zionists, evangelicals, are mostly European white people. Chris Hedges says that imperialism is the external expression of white supremacy. He mentions that Malcolm X and but at one point, a few podcasts back, I read part one from Whitney Webb's website, I don't know, it's podcast called Unlimited Hangout. And part two of this series, titled The Jeffrey Epstein Scandal Too Big to Fail, delves into Ray Cohn's close ties to the Reagan administration, which was also closely tied to the same organized crime network led by the infamous mob figure Meyer Lansky, which was discussed. I discussed it. I read part one. Of particular importance is the Iran-Contra network, a group of Reagan officials and associates who played key roles in the Iran-Contra scandal. Though it has remained relatively unknown for years, many key figures in that same network and several fronts for the CIA that were involved in funneling money to the Central American Contra paramilitaries were also trafficking minors for their sexual exploitation and when I have my camera go dead on me, it's still saying, oops, lost the connection, but I think last week's worked with that same oopsie coming up, so I'm just going to plow ahead. Several of these rings were made headlines at one point or another over the years, from the Callboy Ring, run by Washington lobbyist Craig Spence, to the Franklin Child Sex and Murder Ring, run by Republican operative Larry King, to the scandal that enveloped the Catholic charity Covenant House in the late 1980s. Yet, as this will show, all of these rings more were connected to this network that involved key figures linked to the Reagan White House and linked to Roy Cohn, revealing the true scope of the sordid sexual blackmail operations and sex rings that involved the trafficking of children within the U.S. and even in Central America for their exploitation by dangerous and powerful pedophiles in the United States. Boy, I tell you, one thing about Whitney Webb, she makes a sentence and a paragraph really count. She can make about 18 outrageous statements in just one paragraph. Appalling for both the villainous abuse of children itself and the chilling implications of government by blackmail, this tangle uh-oh, maybe, who knows. Famous figures as art comedian Joey Adams, figures including former mayor of New York, Abraham Beame, and then Assemblyman from Brooklyn and future Senator Chuck Schumer, among others. In 1979, Margaret Trudeau, mother of current Prime Minister, this was written a while back, current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau attended Cohn's birthday party where she famously toppled his custom birthday cake. And of course, Donald Trump, who became Cohn's protege in the mid 70s, was a frequent fixture at social events held in Cohn's honor. The politicians invited to Cohn's exclusive parties were said to be those who had open accounts in Cohn's Favor Bank, his nickname for his unofficial balance sheet of political favors and debts that was surely informed and influenced by his extensive involvement in sexual blackmail operations from the 50s well into the 1980s. Many of Cohn's celebrity friendships were cultivated through his relationship with and frequent appearances at the famous and famously debaucherous New York nightclub Studio 54, which was described by Vanity Fair as the giddy epicenter a particularly close friend of both Cohn and former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, whose involvement in Cohn's sexual blackmail operation is described in part one of this investigative series. So media influence. Newhouse oversaw the media empire that now includes Vanity Fair, Vogue, Gentleman's Quarterly, The New Yorker, and numerous local newspapers throughout the United States, as well as major interests in cable television. New York Magazine also noted that Cohn used his influence in the early 80s to secure favors for himself and his mob clients in Newhouse publications. In addition to Newhouse, Cohn's other high school pals, Generoso Pope Jr. and Richard Berlin, later became owners of the National Enquirer and the Hearst Corporation, respectively. Cohn was also a close friend of another media mogul, Mort Zuckerman, who, along with Rupert Murdoch, would go on to befriend Jeffrey Epstein. Cohn's media confidants, like journalist William Buckley of the National Review and Firing Line, often attacked Cohn's political enemies, particularly longtime Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau, in their columns, using Cohn as an anonymous source. Buckley, whom the historian George Nash once called the preeminent voice of American conservatism and its first great ecumenical figure, received the George Sokolsky Medal alongside Cohn's mob-linked client and supreme commander, Louis Rosenthal, from the Cohn-run American Jewish League Against Communism in 1966. Buckley later got a heavily discounted $65,000 loan to buy a luxury boat from a bank where Cohn held influence and whose president Cohn had handpicked according to a 1969 article in Life magazine. Buckley, along with Barbara Walters, Alan Dershowitz, and Donald Trump, would later serve as character witnesses for Cohn during his 1986 disbarment hearings, and all but Buckley would later draw controversy for their relationships with Jeffrey Epstein. With connections like this, it's no wonder that Stanley Friedman, a law partner of Cohn, who was later imprisoned over a kickback and bribery scandal while serving as New York's deputy mayor, told journalist Marie Brenner in 1980 that Roy could fix anyone in the city. Next section's titled Politically Ubiquitous and Polygamous. Roy Cohn's favor bank and his unique position as a liaison between the criminal underworld, the rich and famous, and top media influencers made him a force to be reckoned with. Yet, it was his political connections to leadership figures in both the Republican and Democratic parties and his close relationship to longtime FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, among other figures, that made him and his dark secret untouchable for much of his life. Though most of his political influence was forged in the 1950s, Cohn became even more powerful with the rise of Ronald Reagan. Even though he nominally maintained his affiliation with the Democratic Party throughout his life, Cohn was a well-known fixer for Republican candidates, and this is clearly seen in his outsized roles during the 1976 and 1980 presidential campaigns of Ronald Reagan. It was during the latter that Cohn would meet another of his proteges, Roger Stone, whom he infamously instructed to leave a hefty bribe tucked in a suitcase at the doorstep of the Liberal Party's headquarters during the 1980 campaign. During this campaign, Cohn would also meet Paul Manafort, an associate of Stone and later Trump's 2016 campaign manager, and introduce both to Donald Trump. Cohn's law partner, Tom Bolin, was also an influential voice in the Reagan campaign and later chaired Reagan's transition team in 1980. Reagan then named Bolin, whom he considered a friend, a director of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the government's development finance institution, and he was also the New York finance co-chairman of the Reagan campaign in both 1980 and 84. Bolin was also close to others in Cohn's circle, such as William F. Buckley, Jr., Donald Trump, and Rupert Murdoch. Furthermore, Bolin was instrumental in securing federal judgeships for several individuals who would later become influential, including future FBI Director Louis Freeh. Cohn also was able to get friends of clients appointed as federal judges, including Donald Trump's sister, Marianne Trump Barry. After Barry was appointed as a federal judge, Trump called Cohn to thank him for pulling strings on his sister's behalf. Though Cohn was not given a public position in the Reagan administration, he was not merely a dirty trickster who worked in the shadows during the Reagan campaigns. In fact, he worked closely with some of the more visible faces of the campaign, including the then communication director for Reagan's 1980 campaign and later CIA Director William Casey. According to Christine Seymour, Cohn's longtime switchboard operator from the late 60s until his death in 86, who listened in on his calls, Casey and Cohn were close friends, and during the 1980 campaign, Casey called Roy almost daily. Seymour also noted that one of Cohn's other more frequent phone pals and closest friends was Nancy Reagan, and she was also one of his clients. Reagan, whose influence over her husband was well known, was so close to Cohn that it was largely his death from AIDS that led to her to encourage her husband to seek more funding for AIDS research. Prior to Cohn's death, Nancy and her husband Ronald secured his spot in an exclusive experimental AIDS treatment program, despite the Reagan administration's well-documented non-response to the AIDS crisis of the era. Ronald Reagan also was a friend of Cohn's and, according to the late journalist Robert Perry, lavished favors on Cohn, including invitations to White House events, personal thank you notes, and friendly birthday wishes over the course of his presidency. Given that Reagan heavily courted the evangelical right and promoted family values as a president, the close ties between not only himself but his inner circle with Cohn may seem odd. However, Reagan, like Cohn, had deep ties to the same organized crime factions that were among Cohn's clients and affiliates of the same mafia figures close to Cohn's own mentor, Louis Rosenstiel. See Part 1. Okay, well, go back and see Part 1. Not unlike Cohn, Reagan's own mentor Lew Wasserman had close ties to the mob. Wasserman, the longtime president of MCA and well-known Hollywood mogul, is known for not only making Reagan's film and television career, but also supporting his successful push to become president of the Screen Actors Guild, which later launched Reagan's political career. In addition, MCA was a major financier of Reagan's successful gubernatorial bid in 1966, and not long after Reagan became president, his administration controversially shut down a massive Department of Justice DOJ probe into MCA's ties to organized crime. According to Sean Swords, a documentary filmmaker who exposed Reagan's ties to MCA in Wages of Spin, Part 2, Bring Down That Wall, here's a quote from that book. Ronald Reagan was an opportunist. His whole career was guided by MCA, by Wasserman and MCA founder Jules Stein, who bragged that Reagan was malleable, that they could do whatever they wanted with him. The thing about Reagan was being tough on organized crime. That's a fallacy. Sword, there, that's end quote. Sword's characterization of his relationship is supported by an unnamed Hollywood source cited in a declassified DOJ document who called Reagan a complete slave of MCA who would do their bidding on anything. What elements of organized crime were connected to Wasserman, you might ask? As a young man, Lew Wasserman joined the Mayfield Road Gang, which was run by Mo Dalitz, a close friend of Meyer Lansky, who, per the FBI, was a powerful figure in Lansky's criminal enterprise, second only to Lansky himself among members of the Jewish mob. Lew Wasserman would later marry Edith Beckerman, whose father was Dalitz's lawyer, Wasserman's closest friend and lawyer, Sidney Korshak, also had close ties to Dalitz and once partnered with Lansky in the Acapulco Towers Hotel. Notably, the magazine New West stated that in 1976, Korshak was the logical successor to Meyer Lansky. Korshak, as a lawyer, fit a niche similar to Roy Cohn and gained a reputation as the bridge between organized crime and respectable society. Enviable position. In addition, the DOJ probe into MCA that the Reagan administration quashed was reportedly spurred after the Justice Department learned that an influential member of the Gambino crime family, Salvatore Pisello, was doing business with the massive entertainment company. At that time, the boss of the Gambino crime family, Paul Castellano, next section is titled Cohn. Though Cohn's influence in the Reagan administration and his friendship with the Reagan family and their inner circle has been acknowledged, less well known is Contra scandal in 1987 and later from the Reagan Library indicate that Murdoch was soon viewed as a source for the private funding for the propaganda campaign. After that initial meeting, Murdoch became the top media ally of this Casey-directed propaganda effort and also became increasingly close to the Reagan White House. Murdoch, as a consequence, benefited greatly from Reagan's policies and his friendship with the administration, which allowed Murdoch to increase his U.S. media holdings and to create the Fox Broadcasting Corporation in 1987. The man in the black tuxedo. Roy Cohn was not the only one close to the Reagan administration who was simultaneously running sexual blackmail operations that abused and exploited children. In fact, there were several figures, all of whom shared direct connections to the CIA director, William Casey, and other close friends and confidants of Cohn. One of these individuals was Robert Keith Gray, the former chairman and CEO of the powerful Washington-based public relations firm of Hill and Knowlton, which 60 Minutes once called an unelected shadow government due to its influence in the Capitol. According to the Washington Post, Gray himself was one of the most sought-after lobbyists in Washington, and a Post reporter once called him a kind of legend in this town. The man in the black tuxedo with snow white hair and a smile like a diamond. Yet Gray was much more than a powerful PR executive. Yes, 33 minutes in. Yet Gray was a much more than a powerful PR executive. Gray, who had previously been a close advisor to both Dwight D. Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, was a very successful Republican fundraiser who collects money in six-figure globs, according to a 1974 report in the Washingtonian. He first came into close contact with what would become Ronald Reagan's inner circle during Reagan's unsuccessful 1976 presidential campaign, and later as deputy director of communications during Reagan's campaign in 1980, directly under William Casey, who later became CIA director. Gray would go on to co-chair Reagan's inauguration committee and afterwards would return to the PR business, taking on several clients, including Saudi arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi and hedge funds manager Mark Rich. Both Khashoggi and Rich will be discussed more in part 3 of this report. Particularly Rich, who was an asset of Israeli intelligence outfit Mossad and whose later criminal pardon by Bill Clinton was largely orchestrated by members of the mega group like Michael Steinhardt and Israeli politicians like Ehud Barak. Particularly telling, as it was later revealed by former Nebraska state senator turned investigator John DeCamp, that Gray was a specialist in homosexual blackmail operations for the CIA and was reported to have collaborated with Gray, with Roy Cohn in those activities. Cohn and Gray were likely to have known each other well, as during Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign, Casey, then Gray's boss, was calling Roy Cohn the where'd it go? Oh, and that Gray and Wilson had been in professional contact 2 or 3 times a month as early as 1963. Though Wilson's main specialty was front companies used to covertly ship and smuggle goods on behalf of the U.S. intelligence, he also ran sexual blackmail operations for the CIA, particularly around the time of the Watergate scandal, according to his former partner and fellow agent at the CIA, Frank Turple. Turple later told authorities and investigators one of Wilson's agent members of both houses of Congress by any means necessary. Certain people could be easily coerced by living out their sexual fantasy in the flesh. A remembrance of these occasions was permanently recorded via selected cameras. Technicians in charge of filming were TSD, Technical Services Division of the CIA. The unwitting porno stars advanced in their political career, some of whom may still be in office. According to In addition, Spellman's nephew, Ned Spellman, worked for Roy Cohn, according to Life magazine. Ritter, like Spellman and other priests who served under Spellman, was eventually accused of having sexual relations and of spending gifts and payments to the vulnerable teenagers he exploited. One of Ritter's victims, Darrell Basile, wrote an open letter to him a year after the priest's preying on teenage boys was exposed by the press. Here's the quote: "You were wrong for inflicting your desires on a 14-year-old. I know that someday you will stand before the one who judges all of us, and at that time there will be no more denial, just the truth." Notably, when Ritter's activities at the Covenant House were exposed in 1989 by the New York Post, Charles M. Sinnott, the Post reporter who wrote the story, would later state, "The secular powers, more than the Archdiocese of the Franciscans, protected him. that is Ritter. Environments, close quotes. Furthermore, Ritter was known to have visited Macaulay's Connecticut estate and served as vice president of AmeriCares until he was forced powerful individuals, including top executives at IBM, Chase Manhattan Bank, and Bear Stearns. It was during this time that Covenant House grew into an international organization, opening branches in several countries, including Canada, Mexico, and elsewhere in Central America. Its first branch in Central America was opened in Guatemala and was headed by Roberto Arzu, a CIA asset whose plantation was used to train the troops used in the CIA's failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Alejos Arzu was also an associate of Moza, and a Catholic order to which former CIA Director William Casey and Roy Cohn's law partner Tom Boland also belonged. Knights of Malta go way back, secret societies. Alejos Arzu also worked for AmeriCares and was tied to several Central American paramilitary groups. Intelligence community sources cited by DeCamp and assert that Alejos Arzu-led branch of the Covenant House procured children for a pedophile ring based in the United States. Years later, Mi Casa, another U.S.-run charity in Guatemala that George H.W. Bush had personally toured with his wife Babs in 1994, was accused of rampant pedophilia and child abuse. The downfall of Washington journalist friend William Safire were just some of the other attendees at Spence's festivities. According to Mr. Spence, the Times article continues. Richard Nixon is a friend. So is former Attorney General under Nixon John Mitchell. CBS journalist Eric Sevareid is termed an old dear friend. Senator John Glenn, a good friend. Peter Ustinov, British actor and journalist, is an old friend. For the European newspaper, after it was founded in 1980 by Robert Maxwell, the father of Epstein's alleged Madame Ghislaine Maxwell, and a known Mossad agent. It was revealed just 7 years after the Times published its doting profile of Spence that his glittery parties for key officials of the Reagan and Bush administration, media stars, and top military officers had been bugged in order to compromise guests. According to the explosive report published by the Washington Times, Spence was linked to a homosexual prostitution ring whose clients included government officials, locally based U.S. military officers, businessmen, lawyers, bankers, congressional aides, media representatives, and other professionals. Spence also offered cocaine to his guests as other means of acquiring blackmail. According to the report, Spence's home was bugged and had a secret two-way mirror, and he attempted to ensnare visitors into compromising sexual encounters that he could use as leverage. One man who spoke at the Washington Times said that Spence sent a limousine to his home, which took him to a party where several young men tried to become friendly with him. According to DeCamp, Spence was known to offer young children forced sex to attendees at his blackmail parties. Spence was found dead in the Boston Ritz-Carlton, and his death was quickly ruled a suicide. The Washington Times report also offers a clue to what Spence may have done for the CIA, as it cited sources that claimed that Spence had spoken of smuggling cocaine into the U.S. from El Salvador, an operation that he claimed had involved U.S. military personnel. Given the timing of these comments from Spence, Spence's powerful connections, and the Iran-Contra scandal, his more than just boasts intended to impress his party guests. One of the most crucial parts of the scandal surrounding Spence, however, was the fact that he had been able to enter the White House late at night during the George H.W. Bush administration with young men whom the Washington Times described as call boys. Spence later stated that his contacts within the White House, which allowed him and his call boys access, were top level officials, and he specifically singled out George H.W. Bush's then National Security Advisor, Donald Gregg. Gregg had worked for at the CIA since 1951, before he resigned in 1982 to become National Security Advisor to Bush, who was then Vice President. Prior to resigning from his post at the CIA, Gregg had worked directly under William Casey and, in the late 70s, alongside a young William Barr in stonewalling the Congressional Pike Committee and Church Committee, which investigated the CIA beginning in 1975. Among the things that they were tasked with investigating were the CIA's love traps, or sexual blackmail operations, used to lure foreign diplomats to bugged apartments, complete with recording equipment and two-way mirrors. Barr would later become Bush's Attorney General, rising to that post yet again under Trump. Furthermore, Barr's father worked for the precursor to the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services, and recruited a young Jeffrey Epstein, then a high school dropout, to teach at the elite Dalton School, from which Epstein was later fired. A year prior to hiring Epstein, Donald Barr published a science fiction fantasy novel about sex slavery. Notably, the same year Donald Barr hired Epstein, his son was working for the CIA. Bill Barr has refused calls to recuse himself from the Epstein case, even though he worked at the same law firm that had represented Epstein in the past. Donald Gregg is also connected to Roy Cohn's influence machine through his daughter's marriage to Christopher Buckley, the son of conservative journalist William Buckley, close confidant and friend of both Roy Cohn and Cohn's law partner Tom Boland. The Washington Times reports on Spence's child sex ring also reveal his close ties to none in the ubiquitous Roy Cohn. One of the Times sources for his first story on the scandal alleged that he had attended. William Casey was also in attendance. Spence was also said in the report to often brag about his social companions and regularly mention Cohn and claimed to have hosted Cohn at his house on occasions other than the aforementioned birthday party. Bodies by God. The revelation of Craig Spence's callboy ring soon led to the discovery of the infamous Franklin child sex abuse and murder scandal. That sordid operation was run out of Omaha, Nebraska by Larry King, a prominent local Republican activist and lobbyist who ran the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union until it was shut down by federal authorities. Buried in a May 1989 article in the Omaha World Herald probe into King's credit union and sex ring is a telling revelation. In quotes, in the 6.5 months since the federal authorities closed Franklin, rumors have persisted that money from the union somehow found its way to the Nicaraguan Contra rebels. The possibility that King's fraudulent credit union was covertly funded by the Contras was supported by subsequent reporting by the Houston Post's Pete Bruton, who discovered that the CIA, in conjunction with organized crime, had secretly borrowed money from various savings and loans institutions to fund covert operations. One of these SNLs had Neil King and the Iran-Contra team is the fact that King had co-founded and subsequently donated over $25,000 to an organization affiliated with the Reagan administration, Citizens for America, which sponsored speaking trips for Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and Contra leaders. The director of Citizens for America at the time was David Carman, who simultaneously ran a public relations firm with its former head of covert operations at the Casey-led CIA, his father, Gerald, who had also been appointed by Reagan to head the General Services Administration and to subsequent ambassadorship, to a subsequent ambassadorship. One of the investigative journalists who researched the Craig Spence ring later told DeCamp that Spence's ring was connected to King. Here's a quote. The way we discovered Larry King and his Nebraska-based cowboy ring was by looking through the credit card checking, where we found King's name, close quotes. It was later revealed that King and Spence were essentially business partners, as their child trafficking rings were operated under a larger group that was nicknamed Bodies by God. Oof. Exactly how many groups operated under this umbrella group, Bodies by God, is unknown. Yet what is known is that the rings run by both King and Spence were connected to each other by the FBI, which used a variety of underhanded tactics to bury the reality of King's sordid operation. Here it is important to recall the key role former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover played in similar sexual blackmail operations that abused children. See Part 1. And the close relationship between Hoover, Roy Cohn, and Louis Rosenstiel, who later employed Hoover's right-hand man at the FBI, Louis Nichols. Years later, documents released by the FBI would show that Epstein became an FBI informant in 2008 when Robert Mueller, the Bureau's director, when Robert Mueller was the Bureau's director, in exchange for immunity from them then pending federal charges, a deal that fell through with Epstein's recent arrest on new federal charges. Not so recent, but the arrest did happen. In addition, former FBI Director Louis Freeh would be hired by Alan Dershowitz, who is accused of raping girls at Epstein's home and was once a character witness for Roy Cohn to intimidate Epstein's victims. As previously mentioned, Freeh's past appointment as a judge for the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York was orchestrated by Cohn's law partner, Tom Bolin. Thus, the FBI's cover-up of the Franklin case is just one example of the Bureau's long-standing practice of protecting these pedophile rings when they involve members of the American political elite and provide the Bureau with a steady supply of blackmail. It also makes it worth questioning the impartiality of one of the main prosecutors in the Jeffrey Epstein case, Maureen Comey, who was the daughter of former FBI Director James Comey. Rot at the top. While there were several sexual trafficking operations connected to both Roy Cohn and the halls of power under it appears that another powerful network that Cohn had cultivated. That individual, Jeffrey Epstein, would be recruited after his firing from the Dalton School by Alan Ace Greenberg, a close friend of Cohn, to work at Bear Stearns. After leaving Bear Stearns and working as an alleged financial bounty hunter for clients that are said to have included the Iran-Contra linked arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi, Epstein would later come into contact with Leslie Wexner, a billionaire close to the Meyer-Lansky linked Bronfman family, who himself was tied to members of organized crime syndicates once represented by Cohn. Hey, don't go away on me, video. The same year, what now? Oh, yeah, the same year that Wexner would begin his decades-long association with Epstein, another Cohn friend with ties to the Reagan White House and the Trump family, Ronald Lauder, would provide Epstein with an Austrian passport containing Epstein's picture but a false name. Lauder, Wexner, and the Bronfmans are members of an elite organization known as the Mega Group, which also includes other Meyer-Lansky-connected philanthropists like hedge fund manager Michael Steinhardt, while Epstein shares considerable overlap with the network described in this report and part 1 of this series. He's also deeply connected to the Mega Group as well as its associates, including Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell. Part 3 of this series will focus on the Mega Group and its ties to the network that has been described in parts 1 and 2. In addition, the role of the State of Israel, like the Mossad, and several global pro-Israel lobby organizations will also be discussed in relation to this network of sexual blackmail operations and Jeffrey Epstein. It is here that the full breadth of the Epstein scandal comes into view. A criminal and unconscionable blackmail operation that has been run by influential figures hidden in plain sight for over a half century, exploiting and destroying the lives of untold number of children in the process. Over the years, it has grown many branches and spread well beyond the United States, as seen as the activity in the Covenant House in Latin America and Epstein's own international effort to recruit more girls to be abused and exploited. All this has been taking place within the full knowledge and blessing of top figures in the world of philanthropy. A lot of non-governmental NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Philanthropy and in the U.S. government and intelligence communities over several presidential administrations, particularly since the rise of Ronald Reagan and continuing through to Donald Trump. And this was written in 2018 when it was just Trump's first term. So when it says continuing through, Donald Trump 2.0 would be an updated version. So next time I'm going to go into part 3, and at this time we're just a little over an hour, so I'm going to bag it. But it's also relevant as to what's happening today as the United States acts like Israel's bitch to carry out something like 200 and so many bombing runs in that first couple days, or that first foray into Israel by U.S. planes, or into Iran by U.S. planes. Come on, daggone it. I want to